including whether or not they use chemical substance. That has never been my style, and I do not intend to change this just because the cameras are turned on. Nor do I intend to dignify Mr. Canseco's book. It should be enough that you consider the source of the statements in the book. My lawyers have advised me that I cannot answer these questions without jeopardizing my friends, my family, and myself.
The point of view is one, unfortunately, that is not shared by our former colleague, Jose Canseco. Mr. Canseco is an unashamed advocate for increased steroid use by all athletes.
He betrayed me. Those 3 words came from one of the most respected managers in the history of baseball. Tony La Russa did not whisper them. He said them with the full weight of a man who had believed in someone, trusted someone, built something real with someone, and then watched that same someone burn it all down for a book deal. And Tony La Russa was not alone. Across dugouts and press rooms and Hall of Fame corridors, the legends of this game stood up and said the very same thing in different words and different voices with different stories. Not just because of steroids, not just because of drugs or needles or big swollen muscles, but because of something far older and far deeper than any of that. Because of trust. Because of brotherhood. If you are into these real baseball stories, go ahead and hit the hype button on this video right now. It takes 2 seconds and it tells me you want more of this. Baseball has always been about more than the game itself. The sport is built on invisible things, the handshake at the end of a hard series, the conversation that never leaves the locker room, the understanding between players that what is shared inside those walls stays inside those walls. This game was constructed by men who gave everything to it. Men who played through broken fingers and tired legs and brutal summer heat because they loved what they were doing and they believed the sport deserved their best. The fans saw that. The fans loved them for it. And the game, for all its complications and controversies over the years, always felt like it was pointing towards something honest. Then came the steroid era. And at the dead center of that era stood one man. A man who hit the baseball harder than almost anyone alive during his peak years. A man who turned heads in every stadium he played in. A man who became the face of a generation and then became the most unwanted figure in the sport he once represented. Jose Canseco. The legends of baseball have never forgiven him. Not for what he did on the field, for what he chose to do off it and the way he chose to do it. Today, 10 of those legends are going to walk you through exactly why. We are going in reverse order. We start at number 10 and count all the way down to number 1. By the time we get there, you will understand just how far and how deep the damage really went. Number 10, Cal Ripken Jr. If you want to understand why Jose Canseco became a permanent outsider in baseball, you have to begin with the man who stood for everything Canseco never was. Cal Ripken Jr. played in 2,632 consecutive games. That is not just a record on a page, that is a philosophy. That is a belief system. It says that you show up every single morning, no matter how your body feels, no matter what the weather is, no matter how long the road trip has been. You do not hunt for shortcuts. You do not look for the fast path around the hard part. You get up and you do the work. Then you do it again tomorrow. Ripken kept his distance from Canseco throughout his career. That distance was deliberate. It was a reflection of how deeply Ripken believed in the game and how seriously he took the responsibility of being inside it. He had built his entire career on honest preparation. Every plate appearance, every fielding play, every inning he took the field for was earned through daily disciplined work. When he looked at Canseco, he did not see a peer. He saw the mirror image of everything he stood for and had devoted himself to. Canseco's career was marked by explosive seasons that came and disappeared, by a power that showed itself in brilliant flashes, but never held the consistency that daily grind produces. And behind that power, according to Canseco's own published words, was a chemical shortcut. To Ripken, that was not simply a lifestyle choice, it was a disrespect for the profession itself. The consecutive games record carried meaning beyond the number. It said one player had decided the game was worth choosing, every single day for years and years, over rest and over excuses. No substance can manufacture that. No injection provides the discipline of 2,632 mornings. Canseco's culture said that the result was what mattered, and the method was secondary. Ripken's entire career was the counter-argument delivered in action every day he took the field. And when Canseco later styled himself as a truth-teller, the brave man who finally exposed the sport's dirty secret, the people around Ripken stayed completely unmoved. Being correct about a secret does not make you righteous if you only revealed that secret because a publishing contract was waiting. To Ripken, Canseco was not a whistleblower in any meaningful sense of the word. He was the man who helped pour the fuel, helped light the match, and then sold tickets to the fire sale. Even before the book, those who spent time inside the game had a feeling about Canseco's character. A quiet, settled sense that he was not a Hall of Famer in the true meaning of the title. Not because of what the stat sheet said, because of the character that stood behind the numbers. the way a player handles himself when the public eye has turned away, the way he treats the history of the game and the men who built it before him. Ripken was that kind of player to his bones. He treated each game as something borrowed from the sport's larger history, something to be handled with care and returned in better shape than it was found. Canseco treated the game as a vehicle for his own elevation. That gap never closed, and the legends of baseball never forgot it. Number 9, Don Mattingly. Don Mattingly was called Donnie Baseball because no one in the sport took the craft more seriously as a personal responsibility. He arrived before anyone else. He worked on every detail. He studied the game and applied what he learned without needing anyone to push him. The locker room was sacred territory to Mattingly. A group of players sharing that space shared a bond of trust that made the whole long season survivable. And there was nothing more destructive to that trust than a player who made every moment about the expansion of his own personal brand. Canseco was exactly that kind of player at his worst. His obsession with celebrity, his visible need to be the loudest name in any room, his self-promotional instinct that ran at full volume even when the situation called for silence. These things worked against team chemistry in ways that statistics cannot measure. A baseball season runs 162 games over 6 months. Through that stretch, a team will hit losing streaks and injury setbacks and bad weeks and internal friction. What holds the group together through all of it is unity, and unity requires that everyone subordinate their personal needs to the collective one. The moment any player decides the team exists to serve his image rather than the other way around, that unity begins to fall apart. Mattingly never launched a public campaign against Canseco. He never went looking for microphones. His critique was expressed entirely through his conduct. He remained stable, focused, and committed to the game while Canseco created friction and noise everywhere he went. The contrast between the two men was clear to anyone watching without needing either man to say a word, but the message underneath Mattingly's silence was unmistakable to the people who understood it. A player like Canseco did not just hurt his own team in the short term, he poisoned something broader. He sent a signal to younger players coming up through the game that spectacle and money were worth more than fundamentals and loyalty. Players like Mattingly, who had invested everything in the quiet art of being a real professional, watched that message spread through the sport and never found a way to make peace with the cost of it. To Mattingly, baseball at its best was a discipline, something you practiced every day like a craftsman who understood that mastery took years and could never be faked. Canseco reduced it to a performance. And performances, however spectacular, are not the same as the real thing. Number 8, Goose Gossage. Goose Gossage never believed in keeping his opinions to himself. He was old school, hard-nosed, and fiercely protective of the game's history in a way that came from genuine love for it. When it came to Canseco, Gossage was direct and certain. Canseco had cheated the entire history of baseball, not the current version of it, the whole thing. Every player who had ever competed before the steroid era arrived, every man who had left himself on the field through honest effort without any chemical assistance, had been robbed and disrespected by what Canseco represented. Gossage's criticism of Canseco went beyond the question of drug use itself. He pointed to a deeper attitudinal failure in Canseco's approach to the game. Gossage noted that players like Henderson had influenced a young Canseco, and that influence had pushed the outfielder toward a singular focus on hitting home runs, because home runs were where the biggest money lived. Not because Canseco loved the art of hitting or the strategy of the game, because home runs paid the most. That attitude, treating the sport as a personal financial vehicle rather than a competition worthy of complete commitment and respect, was what turned Gossage's frustration into something approaching contempt. The Bash Brother mentality destroyed the well-rounded nature of the game in Gossage's view. It converted players into power machines and allowed defense, teamwork, and baseball instinct to deteriorate without consequence. The players who had come before that era gave everything to every part of the game because they believed the game deserved a complete effort every time they took the field. Canseco and the generation he helped define traded that commitment in for celebrity and financial reward. By doing that, they cheated every man who had ever played the sport honestly and with a full, undivided investment. The generational damage was what Gossage circled back to most. If the biggest name in a young player's locker room was entirely about spectacle and personal gain, that told a 22-year-old rookie everything about what the game was supposed to value. It told him that method was irrelevant and results were the only currency. That lesson rippled forward through the sport. Gossage had lived through an era when toughness, dedication, and team-first mentality were the only things that truly counted. Watching that era give way to what Canseco helped build was something he could not set aside or forgive. He saw it as a theft, not just from the players of his own generation, but from every generation that would come after and inherit a sport with a contaminated foundation. Number 7, Nolan Ryan. Nolan Ryan pitched into his late 40s and threw more strikeouts than any pitcher who has ever played the game. He built that career through traditional toughness, disciplined physical conditioning, and a competitive drive that burned just as hot in his final seasons as it had in his first. He was everything Canseco was not in terms of how he approached the sport. And when Ryan looked at Canseco, he did not see a great baseball player making questionable choices. He saw a distraction, a loud, self-promoting spectacle that had set itself up inside the game and refused to leave. Ryan's approach to baseball was built entirely on fundamentals and on a genuine respect for the sport as something larger than any individual. The game deserved to be the focal point, not the player's personal image, not the surrounding drama, not the chants from the crowd whenever a famous name walked to the plate. Just the baseball, the actual competition. Canseco's presence turned that focus upside down. The noise that followed him from stadium to stadium, the chants that greeted him on the road, the constant media coverage that attached itself to everything around him except the actual games, all of it represented a failure of professionalism that Ryan found deeply objectionable. For Ryan, power was part of the game. It had always been part of the game, but power as a substitute for the real virtues of a great ball player was something different entirely. Courage, endurance, the competitive will to show up and fight on nights when nothing was working. These were the things that separated great players from famous ones. Canseco needed the noise. He fed on celebrity and attention in a way that changed the texture of every game he played. That dependence on external validation turned his presence in a ballpark into something slightly less about baseball and slightly more about the spectacle he carried with him. Ryan's longevity was itself a living argument against the shortcut culture Canseco championed. Ryan showed over decades what natural preparation and honest conditioning could produce. Canseco's chemical path created a false version of elite performance that clouded what real greatness actually looked like. And that distortion of the standard, for fans who were watching, and for young players who were learning, was a harm that extended well beyond Canseco's individual career. It made genuine achievement harder to recognize and harder to celebrate because the measuring stick had been secretly moved, and nobody in the stands knew the scale had been rigged. Number 6. Joe Morgan. Joe Morgan was not only a Hall of Famer, he was one of the game's guardians. A second baseman whose playing career was built on sharp thinking, speed, and a preparation so thorough that it bordered on obsession. When the steroid era threatened to corrupt the most respected institution in the sport, Morgan became its most determined protector and most vocal voice. Morgan's core argument was simple, and it was devastating. The players who used performance-enhancing drugs did not only cheat their opponents in the moment, they cheated the entire history of the game. They made clean players who had spent careers chasing honest statistical milestones look smaller by comparison. They raised the record books artificially with numbers that had no legitimate basis behind them. They turned the Hall of Fame from a house of genuine achievement into a space of permanent doubt and question marks. And at the center of all that corruption, in Morgan's view, was Jose Canseco. Morgan sent a formal letter to Hall of Fame voters with one clear purpose: to keep known steroid users out of Cooperstown. He described the Hall as the most sacred place in baseball. He argued with absolute conviction that allowing admitted cheaters through those doors would be a betrayal of every player who had ever earned their spot there through clean performance and true greatness. Canseco had corroded the record books. He had turned the game into something Morgan said was unrecognizable to anyone who had loved it before the era of chemical inflation. What sharpened Morgan's anger beyond the personal was the generational harm. Baseball operates on a transgenerational contract. Each era's players carry the obligation to respect what came before them and to leave something clean for what comes after. Canseco and those around him broke that contract. They pushed the statistical ceiling so high through artificial means that the real achievements of earlier generations suddenly looked modest in comparison. A player who had hit 400 career home runs through a lifetime of honest work found himself invisible in the conversation because someone else had inflated the currency. That was not only a personal insult to the legends who came before, it was a structural attack on the entire meaning of baseball's recorded history. Morgan had lived inside that history. He had contributed to it honestly and with everything he had. And watching it be corroded from the inside was something he could not forgive or let pass without a fight. Number 5. Curt Schilling. Curt Schilling never softened his language when he believed in what he was saying. And when he talked about Jose Canseco, the word he landed on was fraud. Not because Canseco had used performance-enhancing drugs. Many players had used them. The fraud label was specific, and it came from the sequence of events that revealed the true nature of Canseco's character when everything was laid out plainly. Here's that sequence. Here is. Canseco became part of the steroid culture in the 1980s during the early years of his career. He benefited from that culture enormously. He won a Most Valuable Player award. He put together a 40-40 season that became one of the defining achievements of the era. He made enormous amounts of money. He was celebrated and famous and treated as one of the most exciting and dangerous players the game had produced. He gathered every reward the sport had to offer while using the same substances he would later perform outrage about in public. Then, when the playing career was over and the income had slowed significantly, he sat down and wrote a book. He named teammates. He pointed fingers at former peers. And he collected a second major round of financial profit by selling out the same players whose silence had protected him and allowed him to build his career without scrutiny. To Schilling, this sequence was the definition of fraud and hypocrisy combined. The traditional understanding inside a professional locker room is firm and clear about this. If you choose to participate in something, you carry that choice in private. You do not later repackage your own participation as a product and sell it to the public. You do not trade the identities of people who trusted you for a publishing advance. The moment Canseco made the decision to name others in print, he crossed a line that could never be reversed. What Schilling's fraud label captures precisely is the difference between genuine courage and calculated self-interest. A player who had truly wanted to expose a real problem would have taken that information to investigators and authorities. They would have cooperated with official processes. They would not have held the revelations back until the book deal was secured and the launch date was set. Canseco did not expose a scandal because it was the right thing to do for the game. He exposed it because the timing worked for him and it paid well. That distinction, simple as it sounds, told the people inside baseball everything they needed to know about who they were dealing with. And once you saw it clearly, there was no way to unsee it. Number 4. Frank Thomas. Frank Thomas stood 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 250 pounds. He was a physical force of nature on a baseball field, and he produced Hall of Fame numbers over a career that lasted nearly 2 decades. He built every bit of that through natural ability and an absolute refusal to look for anything easier than hard work. He was called the Big Hurt, not just for the damage he inflicted with a bat, but for the toughness he carried into every competition he was part of. And Frank Thomas was one of the cleanest and most principled players of the steroid era, which is exactly why his frustration with Jose Canseco was so precise and so personal. Thomas was calling publicly for steroid testing all the way back in 1995. The league was not listening. The union was not listening. The television revenues were growing and the home runs were pulling fans into seats, and the people with the power to act did not want to interrupt something so financially productive. Thomas stood in that environment alone and said the game had a serious problem that needed to be addressed. The people in charge buried the issue and moved on. When Canseco detonated everything publicly in 2005 with the release of his book, Thomas did not experience it as vindication. He experienced it as a betrayal layered on top of a decade of frustration, because the way it happened was wrong in every direction at once. Canseco did not step forward as a principled voice with a genuine concern for the sport. He stepped forward as a man launching a commercial product. And in doing so, he threw a wide blanket of suspicion across every large, powerful player of that entire era. That blanket did not discriminate between users and non-users. It landed on clean players, players like Frank Thomas, who had never touched a banned substance. Suddenly, every dominant performance by a big, strong player from the 1990s carried a question with it. Thomas cooperated voluntarily with the Mitchell report. He had nothing to conceal, and he wanted the historical record to be unambiguous for anyone who reviewed it. That transparency stood in direct contrast to Canseco's approach, which was always calculated, always timed for maximum personal benefit, always about managing the narrative. To Thomas, Canseco did not rescue the sport. He damaged it in ways that could not be undone. He created a suspicion that distributed itself randomly, landing on guilt and innocence alike, because there was no clean way to separate the two once the contamination had spread. And the players who deserved to be remembered without any shadow had no recourse against a cloud that followed them everywhere regardless of the truth. That injustice stayed with Thomas. The clean players had done everything right and still got punished by association with people like Canseco, who had done everything wrong. Number 3, Rickey Henderson. Rickey Henderson is the greatest leadoff hitter in the history of the game. He built his legacy on speed that defied belief, on baseball intelligence that operated at a level most players could not reach, and on an ability to take over a game in ways that the box score never fully communicated. He was also Jose Canseco's teammate at Oakland, which means when Canseco made his claims about what happened in the clubhouse, Rickey Henderson was one of the few people who was actually there to evaluate them from the inside. When Canseco described in his book how he and McGwire would regularly slip away to the same bathroom stall in the clubhouse to inject steroids together, Henderson did not validate the story. He directed attention to a straightforward physical reality. The bathroom stalls inside the Oakland Coliseum were roughly 2.5 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Canseco and McGwire together weighed approximately 500 pounds. The image of two men of that combined size regularly sharing a single stall for private medical procedures was, in Henderson's assessment, physically impossible to take seriously. The space simply could not accommodate what Canseco was describing, which meant the story was either invented or expanded significantly beyond what had actually occurred. Henderson's refusal to support Canseco's account carried genuine weight precisely because of who was doing the refusing. This was not an opponent speaking. This was a teammate, a man who had shared the same travel, the same locker room, the same 162 game seasons with Canseco. If any player was positioned to know what was truly happening in the private spaces of that clubhouse, it was Rickey Henderson, and Henderson's account did not match Canseco's. That skepticism cuts to the center of the problem that followed Canseco everywhere he went after the book came out. Even granting that some of the broader points he made about the steroid culture of that era reflected something real, the specific details he deployed to build the story appear to have been dramatized well beyond the actual events, made more vivid, more shocking, more cinematic than the truth. Because vivid and shocking and cinematic was what sold books and kept the media cycle running. For a man who was already viewed with deep suspicion by the baseball community, being caught stretching the truth gave the legends one more solid, documented reason to close the door on him permanently. Henderson had built his career entirely on genuine, verifiable achievement. He had no patience for a man who could not tell a straight story when the truth would have been enough. Number 2. Tony La Russa. Tony La Russa is one of the greatest managers in the history of professional baseball. He won World Series championships and earned his place in the Hall of Fame through a philosophy of baseball that was built on preparation, discipline, and a commitment to detail that he referred to as the baseball Bible. For La Russa, there was a right way to do things, and that was the only way he was interested in. Work ethic was not negotiable. Respect for the game was not optional. Showing up ready to compete was the minimum requirement of being in his dugout. Managing Jose Canseco was the most direct and extended challenge that entire philosophy ever had to absorb. La Russa described the experience in terms that made clear just how significant a disciplinary problem Canseco had been. Canseco would openly brag about not needing the gym the way everyone around him did. He had a helper, he would say. That word was a comfortable euphemism that Canseco used casually and without apparent embarrassment. He said it in front of players who were grinding through early morning conditioning sessions and working to build their bodies through honest effort. The message it sent to those players was unmistakable, that their commitment was unnecessary, that there was a better way for people who were smart enough to use it. To La Russa, who had spent his career preaching the exact opposite, that attitude was not just annoying. It was a direct attack on the values of his locker room. When the book came out and the details went public, La Russa's initial response was to call it fabrication. That was a manager in protective mode, doing what managers do when something threatens what they have built. But as the weight of evidence accumulated and denial became an increasingly difficult position to hold, La Russa moved toward a harder and darker acknowledgement. That managing Canseco had left a permanent mark on a career he had spent his life constructing with extraordinary care. The betrayal La Russa carried was not a single wound. It was several wounds stacked on top of each other. There was the personal violation of having trusted a player who then exposed private details for commercial profit. There was the professional wound of having his record turned into a subject of public examination, with people asking what he had known and how long he had chosen not to act on it. And there was the legacy wound, the one that cut deepest, of watching the Oakland Athletics dynasty he had built in the late 1980s become permanently marked by the steroid narrative. He had constructed something extraordinary over years of dedicated work, and Canseco spent those same years and every year after ensuring that extraordinary thing would never be remembered without a cloud attached. La Russa called him a self-serving buffoon. From a Hall of Fame manager who chose every word carefully, that is not a casual insult. It is a considered verdict. It is the conclusion of someone who watched a player choose personal celebrity over every standard the game was built on, and who spent years living with what that choice cost the people around him. Number 1, Mark McGwire. There is no more personal betrayal on this list, no wound that went further back or landed harder. Mark McGwire and Jose Canseco were not teammates in the ordinary sense of the word. They were the Bash Brothers, the most feared hitting partnership in baseball during the late 1980s. They won a World Series together in 1989. During their peak years together in Oakland, they combined for staggering home run and RBI totals. They were selected to the All-Star game together multiple times. They were, for a short and brilliant stretch of baseball history, the most powerful duo the sport had produced in a generation. And then Canseco wrote a book. He did not mention McGwire's name carefully or briefly. He described in specific and intimate detail how the two of them would leave the field and disappear together into a clubhouse bathroom stall to inject steroids side by side. He included private information that could only have existed in moments shared between the two of them. Those moments lived inside the protected space of the professional locker room, the space that every athlete understands to be guarded by an unwritten code of absolute silence. What happens in that space is supposed to stay in that space. That is the fundamental agreement that holds professional sports teams together. Canseco decided that agreement did not apply to him. McGwire's response was not a temporary reaction driven by emotion. His statement that he never wanted to speak to Canseco again was not something he said said in the first days of anger and later softened. It was a permanent decision drawn from a permanent violation, because what Canseco had done was not simply betray a teammate in the ordinary sense. He had forced McGwire into a decade of public examination and personal scrutiny that eventually ended with McGwire confessing his own steroid use in 2010. Some observers pointed to that confession as evidence that Canseco had simply been correct all along, that history had vindicated him. But that argument completely misses the point that McGwire and those around him were making. Being factually accurate about something does not justify any method you use to deliver it. Canseco did not step forward out of principle or out of a genuine desire to serve the game and its fans. He stepped forward because a book deal existed and the timing worked in his favor. He took the most significant professional relationship of his career, the Bash Brothers partnership that had defined both men's best years, and converted it into the commercial centerpiece of a product designed to sell. He packaged the private contents of one of baseball's most celebrated friendships and put a price on it. To McGwire, that was the lowest thing a person inside professional baseball could do. It violated something that had no price and should have had no price. And the fact that McGwire eventually had to stand before the public and confirm what Canseco had written made the original wound deeper, not lighter. Because it meant Canseco had taken something private, turned it into a weapon, and then watched from a distance as that weapon did exactly what it was designed to do. The fact that some of what Canseco wrote proved accurate gave him permanent cover. It gave him a defense he could use forever. He had told the truth, and the truth later came out. But the people who were there knew that the truth had not been served by the method. The method had served Canseco. And those two things are not the same. The Mitchell report arrived, and the congressional hearings followed. With them came the final official stamp on Canseco's role in baseball history. His claim to have introduced steroids into the major leagues as far back as 1985 was on the record. Every achievement of the 1990s now sits next to a question. Every MVP consideration from that decade is complicated by doubt that will never fully lift. And Canseco did not emerge as a hero. He became the most unwanted figure in the sport, cast out by the same community he had claimed to be saving. His strategy of confessing only when it served his media interests produced no rehabilitation and no welcome back. The 10 voices on this list tell the same story through 10 different perspectives. Cal Ripken showed up every single day. Don Mattingly kept the clubhouse sacred. Goose Gossage defended the history of the game. Nolan Ryan demanded that the sport be treated with fundamental respect. Joe Morgan protected Cooperstown with everything he had. Curt Schilling called out the hypocrisy without softening it. Frank Thomas stood for clean performance through an era that made that stance incredibly costly. Ricky Henderson questioned the details from inside the room. Tony La Russa named the betrayal and stamped it. And Mark McGwire lived through the worst of it. Baseball is larger than any one person. It has always been. The sport has survived its most difficult moments, not because the people in it were perfect, but because enough of them cared deeply enough to push back when something went wrong. Frank Thomas raised his hand in 1995. Joe Morgan drew his line. The Mitchell report forced the reckoning the game could no longer avoid. And the fans kept returning because they believed in something real underneath all the damage and the noise. The lesson this era left behind is not that baseball collapsed. The lesson is that baseball corrected, and what allowed that correction was the refusal of the game's legends to let the betrayal pass without a response. They stood for integrity when it was uncomfortable. They chose the harder thing because the game they had given their lives to deserved nothing less. Canseco may have been the one who pulled the curtain back, but the legends of baseball will always remember that he did it for himself. And the distance between doing something because it is right and doing something because it pays is the entire distance between a Hall of Famer and a man without a home in the sport he came from. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these 10 reactions hit you the hardest. Hey, if you are not subscribed yet, right now is a good time to fix that.